Thank you, Kivanç. Our next speaker is Metin Coşgel.
There's actually a nutshell version of my presentation just before the paper on the binders you're looking at. There's like a 3-page version of it. In case I run out of time, the rest of the quick story is there. This is a paper with 2 colleagues at the University of Connecticut, both economists, Rasha Ahmed, a graduate student, and Tom Miseli, another economist on faculty. Let me start with the just justifying why one would want to study this question, the question of the institutional roots of the strong state. That's one theme in this session. There isn't, I don't think, an economic historian, and I'm an economic historian, who hasn't really contemplated this question of the rise of the West. And I'm suggesting, and I've read Timur provoke questions this way, there is another side to this question. This question usually is asked as, why did the West rise? And there's a huge literature on that, of course. The other side of the question is, if you're trying to understand why the West rose, the comparative side is you need to understand why didn't others rise. And that is very much an understudied, but recently fast-growing interest on that question. Now, we are also, in the last 20-some years, the leading answer to the question relating to the rise of the West is the North Wine gas story, or more refined versions of it you can find in Graf's work, for example. And that has to do with the ability of the West to constrain its rulers from arbitrary taxation, granting of monopolies and such. So when we started this project, the natural place to start was to see if it was perhaps the lack of those constraints in the part of the world I'm looking at, the Islamic Middle East, whether the lack of those constraints was perhaps the place to look at. Now, the way I've been looking at this project is sort of like a jigsaw puzzle, so let me give you a sense of the larger project. Just like the jigsaw puzzles that you perhaps played when you were little kids, my kids certainly love to play those. What is different about the jigsaw puzzle that I'm dealing with is you know how the kids' boxes has the picture you're working on? In this project, we don't really know what the picture is. It's sort of scattered pieces all over the place. And to complicate the matters further, there are more than one puzzles, maybe 2, 3, 4. And every time I go to do one of these conferences, another set of puzzles is sort of thrown in the mix. And it's really up to us to sort of pick the pieces and see which one of yours, and some pieces fit into different civilizations as we look at it. So a whole bunch of civilizations are out there in this puzzle, and we're trying to really sort out one piece at a time that we can afford. And the piece that I have decided to look at, only because Timur asked us so, is the legal piece. So I sort of looked around. The minute I saw the judges and so on a piece, I said, this is the piece I want to study. And we're asking whether the legal community, the legal system, could have, and whether it did, constrain the rulers. Okay, so that's really the focus here. Now, before I move on to the question, let me give you another reason for why this is important studying. In economics these days, one of the really fast-growing literatures is on this law and state power relationship. And in the last 5 years or so, a number of articles have been published, all very heavily cited. I actually just recently checked the citations. Every one of these names are in the top 20 list in economics. It's a very, very hot field. What is interesting is Islamic law is very conspicuously missing. And in fact, if you look at these works, for example, the Legal Origins paper, there are 5 categories of legal systems. There is the English, there is the French, there is the Scandinavian, German, forgot the 5th one. Nothing about Indian, Chinese, Islamic, or anything like that. They're all through the colonial heritage, whatever colonies happened to be there, that's the system. But for us historians, although that may serve their purposes today, for us historians going back a century or so, that doesn't help us at all. We need to find out what happened in the Islamic world. So then we turn to the Islamic literature, or the literature on Islamic law. There I was also perhaps not surprised too much to find that now, because this whole stuff is all too recent, ever since especially 9/11, there is a huge literature on Islamic law, as you can imagine, on Islam in general. And in that literature, looking at there's a component of it on law and state power, and Said talked about it as well. What is missing there is the economics component of it. Okay, so we're looking at the law and power in economics. Islamic law is missing. We're looking at the Islamic law literature. Economics is missing. There is our opening to bridge the gap. So what we're trying to do is to bridge this gap by studying the political economy. That's our approach of the relationship between the rulers and the legal community. Now, let me give you first a take on what it is that we understand power to mean. It's the ability of the ruler to tax and spend. Okay, so it's a very simple definition. So then we are asking two questions in this paper. The first is, how could the legal community constrain this power? So as a matter of, at a more theoretical level. And was it indeed, in reality, able to constrain it? So that's the second question that is going to follow. Now, before I move on to the first question, let me first say a few things about what we have in mind with legal community, especially after Said's talk. This is a little bit redundant, but just to refresh your memory. Legal community consists of individuals who could be doing all sorts of functions. They were at some point tax collectors, they are also teachers, they teach the Quran, and so on. But I'm more interested in their function in terms of providing public goods, in terms of the clarification of property rights, adjudicating disputes, resolving disputes among individuals. Now, this happens in two ways. It can resolve disputes between you and I. That is the area that Timur is studying. They also resolve conflicts between individuals and the rulers. And that's where they have an ability to constrain the ruler by way of issuing rulers. Sometimes cases end up in court. For example, somebody sues not so much the ruler, obviously, but a tax collector about collected too much. There are some cases where the ruler indirectly is being challenged because the tax rate is in question, and the legal community is brought in to issue an opinion on what the rates should be, and I'll come back to that. All right, now, quickly now, I'm going to put up this picture there. That's the first picture of the 3 pages I gave you. I perhaps need a little bit of an apology here. This paper is unique in 2 ways. One is of the conference here. That is, it is the only paper I could tell that is co-authored, and that came with a cost of the other uniqueness is at times mathematical. If those of you who decided to take a look at the papers last night before you went to bed, I bet you that's about when you decide, okay, this is time I better go to bed now. Page 8, 9 or so, you hit the mathematics and that's it. Okay, I'm done. So just to, now that I don't have my co-authors with me who are partly responsible for this, the mathematics of it, I'm going to just narrow it a little bit and just shrink it to this one little picture. Actually, let me say a little thing about the model here. Model to economists is a little bit like, I'm Turkish, tea to Turks. We just had our tea and coffee here. Every time those of you visited Turkey or know Turks, you can't imagine a few Turks get together without at some point tea being introduced into their conversation. They get nervous. Let's go somewhere and get some tea, or do you have tea? Let's have some tea. And the same way, you put 3, 4 economists in a room, they get nervous. Where's the model? You have the model? Do you have a pen? Let's build a model. They just can't carry on a conversation without a model. What it does is just to, it allows, it's a sort of facilitator of conversation in both places. And in this paper, because it was co-authored, it was our way of keeping our story straight. Okay, this was the terminology in terms of the way we use what power means, or what we understand, the different theoretical schemes going on. That was our way to keep things under control. So what we are doing here is we're looking at the first question now: how could the legal community really constrain the rulers? And if you look at this curve I'm just pointing at is what's called the Laffer curve. It's the relationship between tax rate and tax revenue. So you don't want to tax people 100%, obviously, because there comes a time, up to a point, you raise the tax rate and people are still producing. There comes a time beyond which people are saying, or they're moving their resources from taxable to non-taxable to the informal sector. They'd rather work at home than in the taxable sector, for example. That's empirical evidence shows that's the case. Now, what we're looking here is, this is the expenditure in terms of, let's say, dollar amounts here, or akçe or whatever unit you're looking at. Somehow the expenditure issue, in the paper we detail how the two are solved together, but let's say that has been resolved, and the ruler's question here is to determine what tax rate should be issued. Now, we can ask this question in three different ways. We can say, okay, the ruler, you can go ahead and choose any tax rate you want, give them a free hand, in which case they're trying to maximize their revenue minus the expenditure. This happens, of course, right here. Okay. I call that TR to say that's the best of all worlds for the ruler, if he had a total free choice. If you can turn around and ask the same question to the workers, what tax rate would you pick? They obviously would not pick this one. Instead, they go to this. Why? Because that's the tax rate that barely covers the expenditures. Anything else, any extra taxes they pay will go to the ruler, not to expenditures. Expenditures are the publicus, the roads and the court system and whatnot being kicked back to them. So they don't want ruler to confiscate any more than that. Now, what is TC here? TC is a way to relate my story to Kivanç's. Those of you who've visited the Boston area, you probably know about the Tea Party ship. That's the tax rate beyond which people are going to start dumping their tea rather than, or they're going to revolt against you or whatever. So the ruler, that's their constraint. Okay? That's the participation constraint. If you raise the taxes beyond that, people are just not going to work. They're going to migrate, whatever their alternative options are. So this may or may not be here. We don't know if it is here. It may be here, okay, in which case it's not binding. Okay. If it is there, that binds the rulers. Obviously, Boston Tea Party happened there and not someplace else. The Ottomans never had a Boston Tea Party because they were smart about not to exceed the tax rate, the story that Kivanç told us, although he had a different spin on that. Now, just to move on now, in terms of to set up the sort of like the theoretical structure here is, if we ask the ruler now, let's introduce the legal community. If the legal community had were charged to regulate this tax rate, how could they regulate it? There are various cases that can happen. One scenario is, let's start with some extreme scenarios here. You could have an absolute dictatorship, in which case the legal community is really a puppet of the government. The ruler says, here's the tax rate, and the legal community goes ahead and does that. Or you could have, at the other extreme, absolute democracy, or perfect democracy, I call, in which case the legal community is lined up with the workers and chooses what I called the workers' choice. Or you could have a case when the legal community is entirely independent. This is closer to the system we have these days. For example, the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court is presumably independent in its regulations, and it decides on the tax rate based on the law, not because it wants to cater to workers or because it wants to cater to the ruler, because whatever the law is, whatever the precedent is. So those are the three cases, extreme cases you can have, but the reality in most times, we're probably in between what I call intermediate cases. The rate would vary between what the workers wanted and what the ruler wanted, somewhere in between. As the ruler gained more power, obviously, you would see the rate go up. So where do we stand right now in terms of the evolution of this argument here is the ruler the argument we are making is it was the relative powers of the ruler and over the legal community and the public that determined the tax rate. So that's sort of the answer to the first question: how could the legal community constrain? They could constrain as much as their power allowed them, or as much as the ruler, putting it the other way, did not control them. Now let's look at the second question. So the question being, in Islamic history, where was the legal community actually able to constrain the rulers? Now, in answering that question, my initial objective was to just look at the Ottoman Empire until Timur urged me, and perhaps others who looked at the Ottoman Empire, to take the story back a little bit. And I also liked that because it gave me a sense to judge the robustness of the story we're telling, whether in other episodes of Islamic history, this relationship that we are trying to explore, whether that make any sense. Okay, so the three episodes that I'm going to look at, it's pages 2 and 3 in the shorter version that I gave you. So if I run out of time, you can find the rest over there. I got the first warning here. And the first episode is the very early formative period of the Islamic history, and the dates that I have there are a little vague. Obviously, we're talking more about a process than an actual event. So the marking it by, let's say, 800 is a little vague. But what is true about this period is it's the formative period of the Islamic law and the legal system. What we have is there isn't really a separate legal community. The rulers are the interpreters of the law, the legislators, and so on. The whole legal system is trying to get off the ground, and rulers have a huge leeway in terms of what they could do. In other words, using some economic terminology here, their monopoly in violence and political leadership extends to their monopoly in legal system as well. So what we have is they add to that power. You probably, some of you at least, would know this history. There is a whole struggle about claiming this title or that title just to boost their power, whether they are the deputy of God or deputy of prophet, and so on. The closer to being the deputy of God, the more powerful you're claiming yourself to be, of course. Now, what did these mean in terms of taxation? In this period, you see all elements of what you would expect somebody who has a lot of power over taxation, namely not so much the tax rate, although that's certainly one component of it that Kivanç has been looking at, but there are other elements of rulers' power, such as discriminatory taxation. You see that start during this period. The taxation of minorities, different religious minorities, or taxation of different regions differently. There's a whole category of tax called kharaj. In the early periods, these are taxes paid by in conquered areas, those who are non-Muslims. But of course, in the second, third generations, as people become Muslims, that whole category becomes obsolete, and the rulers continue still with kharaj, saying, no, it's the land. What matters is in the first conquest what the land's status was. So there's whole interpretations. There's a total free reign in interpreting and applying law in which way they wanted. In the second episode, what we see is in the later Abbasi Empire, as the legal community gets more established, you see it becoming more and more a constraint to the rulers. A good sign of this is I was able to identify about over 20 books with titles varying around Kitab al-Kharaj, book on taxation. Each of these books have a component where the legal community is warning the ruler about what kinds of taxation schemes would be good to do, and they even go so far as to say unjustifiable or illegal types of things. And of course, the rulers have they're not bound by any of this, but this suggests to me that they are starting to say, the ruler is never saying, you wrote this book, you're out. None of that stuff that you see later on in the Ottoman Empire. This is a sign of their power slowly rising. So what we see is this reflects directly in their taxation. There's, in terms of choice among tax bases, there's a story told about, in the bottom bullet there, a switch from what's called misaha to mukasama. and I'm not sure exactly what the actual story went on, but we're told that this has to do with basically in terms of my model, moving from the ruler's tax rate more closer to the workers. Now, let's quickly go over to the Ottoman Empire, and Said gave us a good version of this story, so I can go this a little quickly. The Ottomans do a lot of things to improve their power. It's sort of like they take it in a different art form. They couldn't quite claim to have any inheritance with Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad, although they tried. But that was the connection. But they claim to go back to the Kayik clan of Oghuz Khan. So they claim protector of the holy cities and whatnot. They also introduced distinctive governance institutions that also Said told us about, so I can skip that as well. What they do is the legal system, by the time the Ottomans come to power, is pretty well established by the Abbasids. They sort of took over the basic elements of it, but they take it to a different level. They raise the entry restrictions. You have to go to madrasas that are controlled by. They control these syllabuses of these madrasas, so they control education. They organize it in a hierarchical structure. They give monopoly power to the Hanafi of the four madhabs going right. One of them gets the monopoly power in the empire, and they codify the Islamic law and introduce secular law as an alternative. So the monopoly of the Sharia is slowly disappearing as well. Now they also implement mechanisms, so they raise the monopoly power of the legal community, but they put themselves in charge of the whole hierarchy. So they give, again, Said talked about this, they are in charge of appointing at the top of the hierarchy. The top guy is the ruler's appointee. What happens as a result is the ruler's power, or whatever power the legal community had at the time, is actually the ruler's power. So what you see is, in taxation, you see elements of this. All the elements that I mentioned that you could see early on, and then some, you see here. For example, one example I give, this is my favorite quote, a besut that some of you, I'm sure, know, is given or asked an opinion on whether a tax rate, the usher, which literally means like the teeth, is 1/10, whether it is 1/10 or not. In other areas, it's not. The rate goes up to 40%. In most areas in Anatolia, it's 20% and so on. On top of the other taxes you pay, there are urban taxes. So the tax rate is not a good indicator of the tax burden. But just looking at the tax rate here, so some people obviously complain that you say it's usher, but it's not usher. What's going on? And he said, no, it doesn't have to be. It can go as high as 50%. And the rates vary significantly among different parts of the empire. I wrote a paper on this that I'm citing myself here, but there you go, showing how the tax rates were very, very different in different parts of the empire. And once again, this is sort of like a monopolist discriminating, you would observe in a market today, engage in discriminatory practices. And there are other examples of this in newly conquered areas. They pick and choose. They keep some tax systems as they like it in the new areas, and then some of them they change. Which ones they change? The ones that give power to the local rulers. That again takes us back to Kivanç's paper. They're very concerned about local power remaining small, so anything that would give power to them, such as labor services, they turn all the labor services into cash that flows back to capital. You want me to stop? Okay, I'm just going to quickly just finish it up. So what we have found is there isn't really, if you want to take it just back to the civilization, Islamic civilization, there isn't a pattern in all Islamic societies about the role of the high power of the rulers. And in fact, that was I was surprised to find that. I thought the high power of the rulers is sort of like a thing of the Islamic system that may have to do with religion or the law or the way the system is set up. You actually see in the Abbasid time, the later Abbasid times, that not being the case. That it's another paper that somebody has to think about. That also happens to be the high age, or it's called the golden age as well. Perhaps there is some connection there. All right, I'll just stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Metin. We're going to turn now to our discussants, starting with Ramzi Rouighi.